The battlefield was still, not in peace, but in aftermath. Across the blasted jungles of Theros 8, smoke rose in gentle columns from the craters where once stood watchtowers and relay domes. The final echoes of orbital bombardment had long since faded into the crimson dusk. Beneath a sky veiled by ash, Ethan Vale moved alone through the skeletal remains of a war no one would remember kindly. His combat suit, scratched and blackened, bore silent testimony to 3 days of close-quarters survival beyond the lines. Cracks had formed in the joints. The chest plate hummed with a dying power core. On his shoulder hung a plasma rifle deactivated to preserve its last cell. He no longer listened to the updates crackling faintly through his helmet's comms. No one was coming back. And yet a pulse drew him forward. Somewhere beneath the ruins, a frequency thrummed. Low, harmonic. Unlike any human distress beacon, but persistent, alive. It laced the fog like a whisper from the earth itself. He followed it step by cautious step, deeper into the remains of a research sector once operated by the alien Thalric's dominion. Twisted girders jutted like broken bones from the soil. Crystalline filaments, once conduits now inert, lay tangled like veins underfoot. A single dome remained partially intact, cradled in the wreckage of an ancient observation tower. Inside time seemed halted. The air was thicker. A bioreactive gel clung to the walls in faint ridges, pulsing faintly with stored heat. The structure had been engineered to resist even orbital strikes, its substructure clinging desperately to function. Soft lights flickered through vines of integrated circuitry. At the center of the dome, encased in a containment lattice of fractured energy, floated a figure. The body hung limply suspended upright, head bowed beneath a mane of dark matted hair. Her armor was scorched, patterned with sigils unfamiliar but unmistakably martial. A long gash ran across her torso, sealed by some kind of reactive resin. Her skin shimmered in hues of deep turquoise, an impossible sheen between flesh and luminescence. And when her head lifted, when her eyes opened, they burned like nova flares, crimson, unblinking. Her gaze locked onto Ethan's with no fear, only the raw intensity of a cornered predator too proud to yield. Her lips were cracked. The breath that escaped them fogged faintly against the containment barrier. Around her, the control systems crackled in protest, on the verge of catastrophic collapse. The data scrolling across Ethan's visor painted a grim profile Thalric's vanguard. Subject class Sigma. Bio-enhanced combatant. Extremely dangerous. And yet, the pulse continued. It wasn't mechanical. It was her heartbeat. It resonated through the field, through the walls, through the fragments of scorched metal and dying technology. A frequency laced with biosignature resonance cycling in distress, not calling for aid, declaring survival. He stepped closer. The field wavered, sparking at the edges, and the figure inside shuddered. A tremor passed through her limbs, involuntary but defiant. The lattice around her emitted a rising tone panic mode triggered by proximity. Ethan knelt by the console, dusted off layers of ash and soot, and studied the controls. Alien code flowed in rhythmic cascades. He didn't need translation software. The meaning was simple failure. All systems degrading. Host integrity compromised. He placed a gloved hand on the access pad. The interface scanned him. Denied. Human biology incompatible. He ignored it. Instead, he reached for the energy conduits, found a bypass node, and cross-fed a low-level EMP pulse from his own suit's auxiliary battery. The field convulsed, flickered, then died. The body within dropped like a stone. He moved before she hit the ground. Her weight was substantial, not heavy, but dense, as though her frame had been built to endure gravity greater than Theros 8's. Her breath came shallow and fast against the side of his neck. Her limbs trembled exhaustion more than fear. In that moment, she wasn't a weapon. She was broken machinery, wounded and discarded. He wrapped one arm beneath her knees, the other around her shoulders, and lifted. Somewhere outside the dome, a distant tremor rumbled. The jungle canopy shivered. A deep, angry growl echoed across the hills. The war might have paused, but Theros 8 itself had not. With the alien woman cradled in his arms, Ethan turned away from the broken console and stepped into the dying light. He didn't know who she was, what she had done, what she could still become. He only knew this: she was alive, and no one deserved to die alone in the ruins. The ruins groaned as dusk deepened. Twisted beams cast long shadows across Ethan's path as he moved through the fractured remains of the outpost, cradling the alien woman's unconscious body against his chest. Her skin radiated a slow, low heat, more like smoldering stone than flesh. Each step tested the limits of his exosuit's servos, now operating well beyond intended tolerances. But he kept going. The alternative, leaving her behind, had long ceased to be a consideration. He navigated by instinct and faint memory, retracing patrol paths from early in the campaign. The high ground that once held an atmospheric scanner was now little more than a jagged overlook. But beneath it, the sub-barracks had partially survived the orbital burn. A shattered support frame led to a tunnel mouth veiled by vine-wrapped debris. Inside, the air cooled. Cracked lighting strips blinked weakly in the low ceiling. Ethan eased the woman down onto a polymer bench beside a collapsed workstation. Her armor hissed softly as it depressurized, venting a trace of pale mist from hairline fractures. Her breathing remained shallow, irregular. Blood, dark iridescent, had dried around her temple and jaw. He broke a ration bar and set half beside her. The other half he chewed slowly, not for sustenance, but rhythm. It gave him time to observe. She hadn't stirred. Yet her body's heat output was stabilizing. Her muscle groups occasionally twitched like systems rebooting in sequence. Whatever internal protocols her species used to recover, they were activating now. All he could do was wait. He stripped out of his chest plate, checking for fractures across his ribs. Nothing too serious, just bruises, scorched edges, a dull ache that had settled in and made itself at home. From a side pouch, he retrieved a low-grade med patch, slapped it across the worst of the lacerations, and winced as it fused to his skin with a sting. The silence between them wasn't empty. It pulsed with shared displacement. 2 soldiers. 2 remnants. Whatever banners they'd marched under the war had thrown them into the same ruin, and only one had chosen not to leave the other behind. Her fingers moved, a slight curl. A minute passed, then her eyes opened again. The crimson was dimmer now, but no less intense. She studied him without moving her head, measuring something invisible in the stale air between them. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. There was no need for words in the way her gaze drifted from the fractured ceiling to the emergency light above, and finally to the ration bar he'd left beside her. She didn't touch it, not yet, but her fingers uncurled. Later, as night pressed against the world outside, she sat up, stiff, mechanical, but upright. She reached for the food with precise claw-tipped fingers and brought it to her mouth in deliberate silence. She chewed without expression, without haste. It was a ritual, a quiet pact. Ethan rolled his shoulder, shifted against the bench, and stared at the remnants of the outpost. Burned maps, melted terminals, ghosts in every hallway. When the rain came, thin, acidic, but still wet, it tapped against the cracked bulkhead above them like faint drum beats. She tilted her head toward it, her eyes half-lidded, listening. Her body moved with caution, not weakness calibration, as though she was resetting herself to a world that had tried to erase her. She found a storage unit half-fused shut, ripped it open with the strength of someone who'd once torn metal like parchment, and withdrew 2 rolls of emergency fabric. She tossed one toward him without a glance. He caught it. They built a nest, primitive, efficient, shared. Time passed in flickers, microdoses of warmth, cramped positions, silent glances. Once she offered him a hydration capsule from her own kit. He took it. Their fingers touched. Her skin was fire and stone, not soft, but alive with current. In the second night, something shifted. He stirred at the sound of her breath, closer than expected. She'd moved beside him in sleep, or something close to it. Her hand now rested lightly against his side, not grasping, just there. A quiet weight, like armor forgotten. Neither of them spoke when morning came, but they walked together, through broken barracks, across fallen fences, down collapsed data tunnels and half-submerged bunkers. The jungle had begun to retake everything. Roots split ceramic plating. Moss devoured memory. Yet the two of them, human and Thalrix, moved as one. She never gestured thanks, never offered deference. But in the quiet hours, she began sharing small gestures, adjusting the strap on his backplate where it had loosened. Scouting 5 meters ahead, then pausing, waiting for him to catch up. Reaching for his elbow during steep climbs where rubble had become loose and treacherous. She moved with a kind of mathematics, precise, predictive. But something else had begun to guide her equations now. Something irrational, something human. And then came the first real sound. Her voice, low, almost imperceptible, shaped by a tongue not meant for his language, formed one word. Not his name, but a designation, a role. Protector. Not soldier, not enemy. Protector. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The storm found them on the fourth night. Wind howled through the upper canopy like a wounded animal. Lightning struck with a cold blue brilliance that painted the jungle ruins in flashes of spectral fire. Ethan and Kael had taken shelter beneath a collapsed archway of alloyed bone and crystalline spires, part of a defunct Thalric's comm node, fused into the cliffside. They were close now, not just in proximity but rhythm. Where one moved, the other followed. Where one paused, the other scanned. Each footfall fell in tandem, every silence shared without effort. The gap between them had narrowed to something instinctive, breathing, mechanical, inevitable. Kael had found it first. A passage beneath the comm node's collapsed core guarded by overgrowth and forgotten by war. Inside lay a Thalric shrine, not sacred in any religious sense, but ancient, functional. Technology laced with elegance. Walls alive with dormant energy veins lighting up faintly as Kael moved deeper. At the chamber's center stood a pod. It rose from the floor like a blooming orchid carved in obsidian, half organic, half machine. Tendrils of amber glass looped around a cocoon-shaped basin, above which hovered 3 metallic orbs orbiting a pulsing blue core. The moment Kael touched the basin's edge, the pod sighed open. Air hissed. Lights pulsed. Symbols blinked to life in a vertical rhythm across the walls. First in Thalric's, then in Terran glyphs. Ethan's suit translated just enough. Biostatic interface bond calibration required for activation. Genetic parity insufficient. Synchronization necessary. 2 signatures. 1 link. Kael stared at the readout, her expression unreadable. She moved with careful precision, examining the frame, the conduits, the energy nodes. When she stepped back, her body was rigid, tense. Ethan stood beside her, watching the chamber breathe. He didn't ask. The pod had made its demand clear. The shrine was designed for 2. It needed them both. It was no simple healing device. It was an interface, a ritual. An imprint chamber where minds aligned through a temporary neural overlap, where cells whispered to one another, where memory merged into memory. A risk. But Kael was already removing the upper half of her armor, revealing beneath it a lattice of green-gold skin mapped with bioluminescent veins. Her back bore a line of ridges, each one glowing faintly connective nodes, primed for fusion. Ethan peeled off his undersuit, leaving only the interface strip embedded in his spine. The air was thick with charged humidity and his pulse beat like war drums. They stepped into the pod together. Warm fluid rose around them, neither water nor gel, something alive, semi-sentient. It slid over skin, probing and accepting. The basin tilted backward, aligning them spine to spine, then face to face. Electro-tendrils drifted from above like vines curling against their foreheads, temples, throats. The pod sealed. Darkness folded in. And then everything opened. Memories cascaded like flame through dry brush. Kael's thoughts arrived in bursts. Battle cries from wars light years away, the sting of betrayal when her own commander locked her inside the fallen module, the cold terror of isolation in a language she could not scream. Ethan's memories answered the first man he lost in combat, the taste of blood during a failed exfil, the silence of metals that never filled the void. Emotion wasn't spoken. It was lived, relived, shared in a compression of time so tight it hurt. Pain folded into pain. Trust formed not through explanation but through proximity of agony. Heartbeat to heartbeat, the pod responded. Its lights pulsed faster. Data streamed between the orbs. Their pulses aligned first erratically, then in sync. Ethan felt Kael's body react inside his own perception, her muscles tensing, her fear rising, then fading as her instincts recognized him not as invader, but counterpart. Then came the resonance, a low hum beneath thought, a wavelength that vibrated across every cell. The pod recalibrated. Energy passed through their nervous systems not as force, but as song. They became attuned, alike, but not identical. Compatible. The system chirped once, then submerged them both in a cascade of light. Kael's grip tightened, not in fear, in anchoring. For a moment, they were no longer separate beings. No longer alien and human. They were interface, feedback. One organism split between 2 minds, and then release. The pod drained. The cocoon split. They gasped as one. Ethan collapsed sideways, lungs pulling in real air. Kael knelt beside him, dripping silent. Her eyes met his. They no longer needed language. His breath trembled as he sat up, his body shaking not from pain but from adaptation. Neural clusters along his back still fired in erratic pulses. Kael's hand settled lightly on his chest, steadying him. Their bond had formed. Not permanent, not absolute, but deep enough that her presence hummed inside his skull like a low melody. Her memories lingered, as did his inside her. The chamber lights dimmed, the interface shut down. Something had changed, and neither of them could return to what they were before. The jungle had changed. Not visibly, its vines still clawed through broken ferrocrete, and its trees still rose like smoke-stained spires toward the silver sky, but something in the silence had shifted. The air tasted of static. The birds had stopped singing. Somewhere deep in the canopy, machines stirred. Ethan and Kael moved through the undergrowth as if they had done so forever. Their steps were soundless, their gestures coordinated. The biolink pulsed softly between them, not as speech, but as sensation. A twinge behind the eyes when one felt threatened. A tightness in the gut when the other changed course. Their thoughts didn't blend, but bled edges, touching like hands through fabric. Ethan no longer needed to glance back to know Kael had stopped. Kael didn't ask before changing course. She simply shifted and he was already following. They were not two soldiers now. They were a unit, and the war wasn't done with them yet. The machines came at dusk, slithering down the cliff walls, crawlers, each with a segmented body like a centipede and blades for legs. Their eyes glowed red. Recon drones for the mercenary scavengers who scoured Theros 8's ruins for leftover tech and profit. The first crawler spotted them, but it didn't live long. Kael was already moving, her legs coiled like steel cables. She launched into the air with impossible grace, clearing 5 meters in a single breath. Her elbow struck down like a falling spear, smashing the crawler's cranial module with a crunch of alloy and a flash of sparks. Ethan didn't flinch. His rifle was already up, drawing a clean bead on the next wave, cresting over a ridge. Kael ducked. He fired. The blast tore through 3 crawlers in sequence, but more came 12 now. Too many for standard suppression. The mercenary AI had triangulated their position. Ethan tapped his visor, tactical overlay. The world shifted into grayscale. Vector's enemy arcs danger zones. It flooded into his vision. Kael had it too. Through the link, her neural stem accepted the same data, adjusting for Thalric's interpretation. Their minds moved in parallel. She darted left. He pivoted right. A crawler lunged for his flank. Her boot intercepted it mid-air, sending it skittering into a rock face. He switched to pulse grenades. She lifted an arm, and her wrist-grafted emitter flared to life, scattering magnetic distortion. Together, they were chaos with purpose. Kael's combat style had always been elegant brutality, single strike's maximum efficiency. But now, with Ethan's instincts feeding into hers, she adapted. She waited half seconds longer, allowing him to flush enemies into her traps. He adjusted his reloads based on her angles, never wasting a second. And when he faltered, a crawler slashing through his thigh plating, it was Kael who caught him. Mid-stumble, spun him behind her and launched her own plasma blade straight through its neural core. Blood sprayed. Not his. The battle ended with smoke and severed limbs. Ethan leaned against a jagged column, panting, the wound on his thigh hissing from cauterization foam. Kael stood over the last crawler, her fingers still trembling with residual current. For a moment they said nothing. Then the pulse between them quickened, not in fear but awareness. The biolink responded to danger, but it also adapted to success. It learned patterns, reinforced feedback loops. Where Kael once operated on logic, she now processed Ethan's emotion as input, his adrenaline, his defiance, his protectiveness. In turn, he received her clarity of vision, her endless calm. Together, they'd become more than soldiers. They were weapon and will, mind and instinct. She turned to face him fully. Her face was flushed with heat, her jaw flexing as if holding back something not quite language. The corner of her mouth twitched an expression that felt alien on her until now. Ethan laughed, not from joy, but from the sheer absurd tension. They weren't supposed to survive, and yet here they stood. The ridge above them shook. Something massive stirred on the horizon, a ripple in the forest canopy, the distant crack of hydraulic limbs. The mercenary faction had noticed. Their drones hadn't returned. Something heavier was coming. Kael stepped forward, raising her hand to the air. Her gauntlet hummed as it interfaced with local Thalric's frequencies. The sky flickered. A distant satellite array still orbiting the planet responded with a brief garbled ping. Not enough to transmit, just enough to warn. The enemy would arrive within hours, and this time they would come armed for war. Ethan checked his power reserves, dwindling. Kael opened her palm. From it, a small note of alien tech emerged, a resonance shard. She handed it to him without explanation, but the link made it clear it was for synchronization. An upgrade. Temporary fusion to push the interface further. His hand closed around it. Pain surged, not sharp, but deep. A restructuring. The shard integrated into his palm, syncing with his nervous system. Instantly, colors sharpened. Sound came with depth. He could feel her heartbeat in his own chest. They stared at one another. The next battle wouldn't be a fight. It would be a revelation. The forest floor hummed with tension. Somewhere in the distance, metal boots crushed vines. Engines pulsed beneath the earth. The jungle's natural predators had long since fled, replaced by something worse. The scavenger faction had deployed its warform. A bipedal siege unit 30 meters tall, reinforced with nano-steel plating and equipped with a neural net interface capable of adapting to enemy tactics in real time. It was called the Core Reaper, not for poetic flair, but because it extracted fusion cores from captured facilities, alive or not. Ethan and Kael watched from atop the shattered ridge, surrounded by broken statues and vines that glowed faintly under the twin moons. Their biosignatures were already blurred. Kael's internal systems emitted static cloaks, and Ethan's reprogrammed shard mimicked Thalric's drone IDs. Below, the Reaper stepped into view. Its movement wasn't mechanical. It was graceful, almost organic. Legs sank and rose with hydraulic silence. Its head swiveled in calculated arcs, red scanning beams carving lines through trees and stone. It was hunting, and it wasn't alone. 4 escort units, automated sentries, moved ahead, clearing debris and pinging threat clusters. Behind them, a drone hive hovered in slow orbit, absorbing environmental data and relaying it back to a command vessel somewhere in low orbit. Kael's hand hovered over the ground, her fingers tracing ancient glyphs etched into the ridge's stone. She wasn't just hiding, she was aligning. The ground here resonated with Thalric's energy, older than her people, older than the war. Ethan crouched beside her weapon at the ready visor, flickering with the biolink's upgraded feed. His HUD now pulsed with Kael's vitals, tactical thoughts compressed into sensory fragments. He didn't hear her thinking, but felt the decisions as if they were already his own. Behind them, something stirred. It wasn't mechanical. It was alive. A low hum rose from the ridge itself, a frequency not unlike the one that had led Ethan to Kael in the beginning. But this was deeper, more complex, a resonance nested in a resonance. The ground split open. A core chamber bloomed, revealing a sphere of energy suspended in a cradle of alien bone and silver thread. It pulsed in time with Kael's heart. She stepped forward, eyes half-lidded, and touched the cradle. The reaction was immediate. The chamber ignited. Holograms burst into life, spinning, unfurling, depicting sequences of Thalric's glyphs, interlaced with a second pattern DNA spirals. Ethan's breath caught. It wasn't just a core, it was a Genesis chamber, and it was responding to Kael, or more precisely, to what was inside her. Ethan turned sharply. His biolink surged with a flood of input. Biological systems, hormone spikes, neural variances. The shard in his hand pulsed hot. He recognized the pattern, early gestational signals encoded not in human terms, but in Thalric's neurobiology. Kael was pregnant. The link hadn't just bonded minds. It had ignited something deeper, instinctual, ancient. A gestational protocol triggered only under extreme emotional resonance. The chamber, sensing the presence of a Thalric's heir bonded to human physiology, began to change. And the Reaper had felt it. Its head turned, slowly, mechanically. The red beam sliced straight toward the ridge. Kael's body tensed. Ethan reached for his rifle. The Core Reaper charged its main cannon, and then everything moved. Kael leapt first off the ridge, down into the clearing below. Her bioluminescent lines flared bright gold, and every drone on the battlefield pivoted toward her. Ethan followed, heat screaming in his chest, the biolink feeding him her trajectory before she even moved. She sprinted low, weaving through fallen trees, sending feedback pulses that jammed the drone hive's targeting. Ethan moved wide, flanking the Reaper, syncing his fire pattern with the pulses Kael was emitting. Together they were noise in a world of order. The Reaper fired. The ridge exploded in a burst of plasma shards of old Thalric stone, scattering like embers. But Kael had already slipped into the shadow of the Reaper's foot, scaling its inner joint. Her hands crackled with energy. Not weaponized, not yet. She was rerouting something through herself, using the child not just as life, but as key. Inside the Genesis chamber, the AI had begun to change. Systems across the battlefield hiccuped. Drone responses slowed. Hive signals staggered. Ethan saw his chance. He vaulted onto the Reaper's side plating, jamming his shard-enhanced gauntlet into a subservience node. The feed flooded him with data, raw, brutal, unfamiliar. The warform resisted. Its neural net fought to rewrite his code. But it wasn't just his anymore. Kael pulsed through him. Their child pulsed through them both. A harmonic wave burst from the Reaper's chest, visible in the air like ripples across water. The escorts dropped to their knees. The hive blinked out. The core Reaper staggered, sparks hissing from its spine. Inside its systems, the war stopped. The unit kneeled, not out of defeat, but recognition. Ethan fell hard to the ground, coughing, vision flickering. Kael was beside him a moment later. Her hands found his chest, pressed lightly. The biolink steadied. His pulse slowed. They looked up. The battlefield was silent. Not because the enemy had been destroyed, but because the child had been acknowledged. Not yet born, not yet formed, but already connected to everything around them. The machines had felt it. The Reaper had been a collector of cores, but this was different. This was life forged of conflict, sealed in mutual sacrifice. A new core, a future one. The war ended quietly. Not with flags or treaties, not with declarations from orbital command. It ended in the silence left behind by the core Reaper's bowed head in the stillness of the escort units frozen mid-stride, and in the absence of drone surveillance that had once blanketed Theros 8's skies. No signal came from the scavenger fleet above. Either they had seen what happened and chose retreat, or the link between machine and handler had been severed completely. The jungle began to breathe again. Ethan and Kael lay beneath the fractured dome of sky, side by side, on the bed of moss and rubble, their hands close but not quite touching. Between them, the air vibrated faintly, not with noise, but with the same low hum that had drawn Ethan to her days before. It was stronger now, steady, laced with 3 pulses instead of 2. The link had deepened. He felt the rhythm inside her as though it were his own heartbeat, but subtly distinct, new, small, forming. Not just alive, aware. The Genesis chamber had sealed itself after the harmonic wave, folding back into the earth, protected by layers of Thalric's shielding that responded only to Kael's biometrics. It had recognized the child as an heir, not a warrior, not a weapon, but a convergence. Human chaos, Thalric's order, balanced. They walked through the ruins in silence, their path lit by the occasional flicker of bioluminescent moss and the faint glow of Kael's still-active gauntlets. Ethan's suit had been patched with temporary nano-weave, held together more by willpower than engineering. But he didn't feel broken. Not anymore. They passed through a valley of old war machines, all deactivated now. The Reaper stood at the edge, immobile arms locked at its sides like a sentinel. The escort units formed a perimeter around it, guardians not just of steel, but of change. Word would spread. Someone somewhere would find the sensor logs, detect the power spike, interrogate the moment the machine stopped obeying human or Thalric's code and began responding to something else. And that something had a name, unspoken, undefined, but carried in Kael's blood, written now into Ethan's DNA. They didn't return to command. There would be questions, of course, inquiries, trials maybe, and they could not risk the child being reduced to an experiment studied, dissected, used as leverage in a war that had only ever served the powerful. So they disappeared. First into the deeper jungles where the sky ran dark with ancient trees, then into the off-grid lanes between orbital debris fields. Kael charted the path using Thalric's code that hadn't been spoken in a generation. Ethan scavenged supplies, reprogrammed drone husks for transportation, modified his own biology, just enough to evade standard scans. Together they were a shadow, but also a seed. In time, they reached an unclaimed moon cloaked in dust rings and magnetic anomalies, a place ignored by nav charts and dismissed by empire builders as inhospitable. For them, it was perfect. The soil was rich with latent energy, the atmosphere thin but adaptable. And when they stepped down onto the obsidian ground, Kael reached out instinctively, placing her palm over her belly, now softly curved. A gesture not of fear, but promise. Their home began with 3 sets of footprints in black dust, and it grew. Over the months, they built not just shelter, but understanding. Ethan crafted crude tools while Kael taught him to interpret Thalric's resonance fields. He showed her how to ignite fire without plasma, how to plant with patience. She taught him the philosophy of motion, how even stillness could be a weapon if timed well. They didn't speak often, they didn't need to. The link remained, and with the child growing, it deepened even further. Sometimes Ethan felt flashes of thought, not his own images. He'd never seen places he didn't recognize. The child dreaming through them both. Kael's reaction to those moments was calm, but behind her eyes a kind of awe bloomed that she never tried to hide. Their child wasn't just growing, it was learning. Not from teachers, but from the intertwined memories of two warriors who had once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield and chosen not to finish the war. In the evenings, under twin moons not unlike those of Theros 8, they sat in silence. Kael would hum sometimes low vibrations that stirred the stones beneath their feet. Ethan would carve useless shapes into the dirt, laughing at how poorly he remembered Terran geometry. Neither corrected the other. There was no longer a need for that. The child kicked for the first time during one of those dusks. A light flutter beneath Kael's ribs. Ethan didn't reach for it. Kael took his hand and placed it there herself. Their breath matched. The biolink shimmered. A fourth heartbeat, impossibly faint, echoed between their ribs. They would not live in peace forever. But for now, against all logic, all war, all history, they were family. And somewhere out there, the empires that built the machines would learn that the Core Reaper had bowed not to a weapon, but to a whisper of life. Years passed. Stories began to circulate across the frontier systems. Unofficial reports of a war machine that halted mid-assault of scavenger drones that powered down without orders of an alien signal no longer belonging to any known faction, but pulsing with strange harmony. They spoke in hushed tones of a child born of the link, a hybrid who could quiet weapons with a thought, who walked in dreams shared between species who rewrote the code of war, not with fire but with resonance. Some claim to have seen them. A woman with skin like storm glass and eyes like dawn. A man in fractured armor who smiled as if he'd seen the end of the world and chosen love anyway. And between them, a small figure glowing faintly, carrying not the burden of history, but the future of what could be. The empires couldn't find them, but the machines remembered. And in every battlefield that fell silent for no reason, in every AI that hesitated at the edge of destruction, the signal pulsed faintly again. Kael, Ethan, and the child born of bond. They had vanished, but they had also begun. Thank you for joining us on this cinematic journey through memory, battle, and rebirth. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a comment below, or sharing your favorite moment. We release long-form sci-fi tales like this every week, stories where love meets logic, war meets wonder, and humanity proves again why it matters.